From elite women of color to transgender girls in school sports, certain bodies keep being treated as problems that sports need to solve. Behind the language of fairness and biology is a familiar story about race, gender, power, and whose bodies are allowed to belong without explanation. Today's episode isn't really about sport at all. It's about marginalized genders, moral panic, and the psychological cost of being endlessly put on trial. I'm Aurora, and this is Intersectional Psychology. Stick around. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology acknowledge the traditional owners and custodians of country throughout South Africa and their connections to land, water, and community. We pay our respects to their elders past and present, and extend that respect to all Indigenous people listening today. Episode 6. Whose bodies belong in sport? There are a few athletes in the world whose bodies have been treated as public property. Fewer still whose bodies have been treated as international problems, such as the most recent examples of Zambian footballer Barbara Banda and Algerian boxer Iman Khalif. But today's episode is mostly about another of them, Mokgadi Caster Semenya. The indignities she experienced, for example being forced to undergo testosterone-reducing treatments by World Athletics, then known as the International Association of Athletics Federation, or the IAAF, revealed broader issues of gender and racial discrimination and representation. Now, before we even begin, I want to say this clearly. This is not just a story about sport, and it's definitely not a story about hormone levels. It's a story about gender, race, power, and who gets to decide what counts as quote-unquote normal. It's a story about how Black women's bodies are still policed, sometimes with clipboards, sometimes with lab coats, and sometimes with deceptively polite legal language. Global media narratives of Semenya's biological and gender identity, despite being adopted by some segments of the South African media, nevertheless echo some colonial and paternalistic attitudes that still divide the global North from the global South. Using Caster Semenya's case as an example, we'll explore the changing representation of women's sports, as well as representation of LGBTQIA+ identities. So, on your marks, get set, and let's go. The single shallow story. Caster Semenya is, objectively speaking, one of the most successful middle distance runners in history. 2 Olympic gold medals, multiple world championship titles, Commonwealth Games golds, continental titles, Diamond League wins. She is also a wife, a mother, an author, a coach, an activist, and at one point, even a footballer. And yet, if you ask most people what they know about Caster Semenya, the answer is rarely about her achievements. Instead, the story collapses into one word: testosterone. And once someone is reduced to a single narrative, especially a biological one, it becomes very easy to stop seeing them as fully human. In Semenya's case, and also Barbara Banda and Iman Khalif's cases, that single story draws on something much older and much uglier: the colonial habit of treating African bodies as objects to be examined rather than people to be respected. The subtext is rarely subtle: too strong, too fast, too quote-unquote masculine, too African, and always too much. Institutionalized gender policing. Let's talk about the rules. World Athletics introduced regulations requiring certain women athletes to medically reduce their natural testosterone levels in order to compete. Not enhance, reduce. The IAAF's policies mandating testosterone-reducing treatments for certain female athletes exemplify institutionalized gender and race discrimination. Men, interestingly, are not asked to medically intervene if they have natural advantages, whether that's height, lung capacity, or muscle composition. No one tells Michael Phelps to apologize for his wingspan. What's being regulated here isn't fairness, it's quote-unquote femininity. These policies are deeply Eurocentric. They rely on narrow Western ideas and norms about what women's bodies are supposed to look like and how they're supposed to perform. And when those ideas meet black women from the global south, the result is often suspicion rather than celebration. Such policies perpetuate systemic bias against athletes from the global south, like sinister echoes of the colonial practices of measuring and categorizing African bodies. The science, too, is shakier than it's often presented. Testosterone alone does not determine athletic performance. The notion of defining a quote-unquote normal testosterone level is inherently flawed, given the biological and hormonal diversity among athletes. Bodies are complex. Biology is messy. Sport has never been fair in the way we pretend it is. What is clear, though, is that women's bodies, especially gender non-compliant women's bodies, are treated as problems to be solved, or specimens on which to experiment. The decision to regulate her testosterone levels is a clear case of eugenics, which brings us to ethics. Human rights, not just sports. Julian Savulescu, a professor of law and biomedical ethics at the universities of Oxford and Melbourne, highlighted 10 ethical flaws in the Caster Semenya decision. They concluded that this ruling violated principles of fairness, autonomy, and justice. The Court of Arbitration for Sport later acknowledged something crucial in Semenya's case, that the regulations are discriminatory and that they violate her right to privacy. And yet, she still isn't allowed to compete. So yes, there was technically a legal victory, but it's the kind of victory that comes with an asterisk. Semenya's case matters not only because of what it says about sport, but because of what it says about whose rights are negotiable. And media representations amplify this scrutiny, often sensationalizing Semenya's identity and reinforcing exclusionary narratives. These portrayals not only perpetuate stigma, but also underscore the urgent need to challenge systemic discrimination. Her fight has been supported by the South African government and international human rights organizations, precisely because it exposes a larger truth, that systems claiming neutrality often reproduce inequality very efficiently. Historical echoes. Sarah Baartman. South African feminist scholar Puna Dineo draws a chilling parallel between Caster Semenya and Sarah Baartman. Baartman's body was displayed, dissected, and pathologized in Europe in the 19th century, measured against white femininity and found obscene. Baartman was objectified and dehumanized based on the ways her sexualized physical appearance differed from idealized white femininity. But she hadn't been the one sexualizing herself. The choice to uncover and put her body on display, to draw attention to specific body parts by exposing them on parade, that was made by the European men who had colonized and enslaved her and her family. Semenya's body might not be exhibited in a museum, but it is scrutinized, regulated, and disciplined by overwhelmingly white institutions. There's an important difference though. Baartman was marked as too feminine. Semenya is marked as not feminine enough. This comparison underscores how cis-heteropatriarchal and racialized frameworks continue to marginalize individuals who defy normative Western gender expectations. Different centuries, same logic. This is what racialized gender policing looks like when it updates its language but keeps its assumptions. Women's sport and media silence. Even without Semenya's case, women's sport is still marginalized. In 2023, only about 15% of sports media coverage focused on women's sports, despite women competing in nearly all Olympic disciplines. Yes, the coverage has improved. Representation had nearly tripled in the preceding 5 years. But improvement doesn't erase history. It just makes the gaps more visible and underscores the need for continued advocacy. Initiatives like the International Olympic Committee's updated portrayal guidelines aim to address these disparities in the media, yet systemic issues persist. When women athletes are covered, those who don't conform to traditional femininity face additional scrutiny. And Semenya sits right at that fault line. South African media have at times challenged the international narrative, exposing its political and racial undertones. But media also reproduce inferential homophobia, the quiet suggestion that her gender, her sexuality, and her body are all part of the same quote-unquote problem. That further marginalized her within the sports community and thereby separated her from potential allies, such as other sportswomen or athletes. This media portrayal not only affects public perception, but also impacts the opportunities and support available to all female athletes. Because once again, it is women and only women who are subjected to gender testing. Patriarchy, if nothing else, is consistent. Queer visibility and resistance. Caster Semenya is openly gay, and her marriage to Violet Raziboya is not incidental. It's quietly radical. In a context where her womanhood is constantly questioned, it would have been easy for her to try to quote-unquote prove her femaleness by conforming to all other gender expectations, for example by dating men. She didn't. Instead, she made her family visible. She confronted the archaic Eurocentric scrutiny. She dared her critics to expose their personal biases. This matters because queer representation in South African media still often perpetuates stereotypes and stigmatization. As Bradley wrote in 2023, the media often reduces queer stories to the extremes of crying, dying, or marching for pride. Semenya defies those caricatures. Her visibility disrupts the lie that femininity, heterosexuality, and womanhood are naturally aligned. And that disruption is precisely why it is threatening. Representation as Stuart Hall reminds us that representation doesn't just reflect reality, it produces and creates it. Meaning is made through discourse, through repetition, through what's framed as normal and what's framed as exceptional. And when what's being repeated was an imitation or distortion to start with, it erodes the truth. Media portrayals of Semenya as an quote-unquote abnormal athlete don't just misrepresent her, they police the boundaries of gender itself. Her body becomes a battleground where race, gender, sexuality, and power collide. And what her case ultimately exposes is this: sport doesn't just measure performance, it enforces social norms. Caster Semenya's story is not about biology, it's about belonging. It asks a question that sport and society still largely ignores. how do we make space for everyone to be included with equity? And until that question is answered differently, Semenya's resistance, simply by existing as she is, remains profoundly political. If you're still with me, the conversation doesn't end here. In the bonus segment, I zoom in on what's happening right now, including a landmark US Supreme Court case on transgender girls in school sports, and what it reveals about how law, science, and fear get woven together. Because once you start looking closely, it becomes a lot harder to believe this was ever just about fairness. That's over at patreon.com/intersectional psychology. When we follow stories like Caster Semenya's all the way through, we start to see a pattern. Recognition without redistribution is never enough. In the final episode of this series, we'll turn to economic empowerment. Because justice doesn't only live in discourse, law, or identity. It lives in material conditions, in who has access, who has options, and who gets to live with dignity rather than precarity. That's next time in this series on intersectional psychology. Until then, remember, everyone has the right to live with their optimal mental health.
Thank you for listening to Intersectional Psychology. Please follow or subscribe to the podcast to get every episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please rate and review Intersectional Psychology in your preferred app. It really helps other people find the podcast. This episode of Intersectional Psychology was researched, written, recorded, and edited by me, Aurora Brown. For a transcript of this episode, please see the link in the show notes on your podcast app or go to intersectionalpsychology.com. You can also check the website or the show notes for a full list of references for this episode. A video of this episode with closed captions is available on youtube.com/@intersectionalpsychology. To support this podcast and get access to bonus content, including additional episodes and interviews, as well as more guided mindfulness sessions, please go to patreon.com/intersectional psychology. You can also chat with me on Blue Sky at intersectpsych.bsky.social and Instagram, Facebook, or TikTok at intersectional psychology. But mostly Blue Sky. Aurora Brown and Intersectional Psychology are committed to the Cite Black Women praxis. All episodes of Intersectional Psychology are for educational purposes only and are not intended to be a substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. I, Aurora Brown, am not able to answer specific questions about individual situations. Always seek the advice of your health provider with any questions you may have regarding a mental health condition. Never disregard professional medical advice or delay in seeking it because of something you have heard or seen on this podcast. If you think you need immediate assistance, please call your local emergency number or any mental health crisis hotline. Everyone deserves good mental health.